Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for tuning in to the TKC Games vlog number 2. First things first, sorry we have been a little bit slow in getting this out, but we've been extremely busy doing some game development work. I'm joined again with Geoffrey, who you will have known from the first one, is one of our researchers and has a real fascination with naval affairs. To be fair, he's also been looking with me at the Ukrainian mess, which we will come back to. At the moment, so you know, just to update you, Geoffrey has completed the Royal Navy's basic research for World War I, which has not been a small task. How many ships was that, Geoffrey?
2,500.
That's not bad going, given it's only taken him about 6 months, which, frankly, from my experience, is really good going. The US Navy in World War II is about the same size and is absolutely horrendous to research. So he has now moved on to the German Navy. That will take a bit less time. There's a lot less to look at, fortunately. And then we'll hopefully, by the time Christmas comes, we'll be at a point where we're able to start putting together the first 2 games in the series as promised. That should be really exciting for us all. And hopefully that will get you guys really excited and want to pre-order some games. Now, I myself have been working hard on Balkan Fury 2, which has involved looking at between 6,000 and 8,000 units so far, from all the various militaries involved, mostly the Germans recently, to be fair, which is bringing it up into line with Barbarossa and the other new titles we've got in planning or development right now. That's really important because it keeps the system consistent. It's one of the reasons why our game system actually works. And by that I mean, if you take historical decisions, you will get historical results. All good so far with that. So what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, given we've got a huge amount of naval interest, Geoffrey is going to hit us up with some things about what is a battle cruiser? Why are battle cruisers seen as being a failure? Why are they not necessarily seen as a success, and why do they work and why don't they work? And the other thing we're going to do initially is we're going to take a look at the Ukrainian mess currently, work out what has been going on. The answer is a lot of grinding away by both sides and not a huge amount of movement, to be honest. And we're also going to take a little look at how that compares with the Soviet liberation of Ukraine in 1943 and 44. The answer is, frankly, not very well, but equally not as bad as people are making out. So, first point we're going to have a quick look at is this lovely map that we've got over on the screen here, which actually will be walks you through current operations. Now, reported Ukrainian partisan warfare in here, if these people are doing that, and bear in mind an awful lot of assault rifles were dished out by the Ukrainian government, if they're not an accredited and accepted force, shooting a partisan is not a war crime. That's a military necessity and is fully accepted under international law. At the same time, if you round up civilians and just randomly machine gun them because you think possibly some of them might be partisans, that can be seen not so much as a war crime but as a crime against humanity, and as such would and should be prosecuted heavily. It has to be questioned though as to whether or not someone in the Red Army, sorry, Russian Army, because they keep changing its name, would ever actually be able to stand trial, because I can't see any Russian government, certainly not one led by Putin, accepting that as a thing to do, even if they were to lose this war, which I have to admit doesn't look very likely. So the dark crosshatch areas were essentially Russian-controlled territory prior to the invasion. In early February, they moved down to Kiev, as everyone can remember. They moved down to the Sumy area, just a little bit where the mouse is, just there, and they advanced to the other side of Kharkov. I know from friends who've actually escaped from Kharkov that they didn't close a pocket there ever, initially. But as of May, the city was encircled, and it does appear that Ukrainians have managed to open up supply lines into the city and continue to try and drive back Russian forces, which is the pale blue area here. Further south, the pale blue area around Kherson and to the west of Zaporozhye, those areas there have been getting counterattacks for the last 6 months, near enough. Nothing much seems to be going particularly well for the Ukrainians there, and I'm not overly surprised because the terrain is not conducive. If we zoom in on the map, this very faint grey line is in fact the Dnieper River. And as you can see, it comes down into this area here through Kherson to the water. Now, there are other river lines in this area, and I've no doubt both sides are utilising them to minimise movement. Further east, over this way, you can see that from the Kharkov area, they did drive south. They have taken Luhansk. They've taken the city, what's the name of it, Geoff, that begins with S? I can never remember the damn thing.
Sverdlovsk.
That's it, which is Stalino, for those of us who know World War II. And they've taken Mariupol and across to Kherson. They now have a railway line which runs somewhere along this area here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up one of our own in-house maps. And this map here is from Barbarossa, our World War II game dealing with the Eastern Front. So the black line here is the Kharkov military district, but it does appear the border started out in this area here and came up all the way along this way, right up to Belarus, which is along here and around that way. So you may recall that our Russian friends, if you can call them that, attacked down this railway line here towards Kiev. And the Irpin Air Base happens to be on a main rail line, interestingly enough. My suspicion is the strategic withdrawal that they then did, back up the same way they came in, really was not forced. It's simply put, they couldn't logistically support the forces there. Now, they appear to have been moved all the way around here. Around the Kharkov area, the Sumy offensive that we mentioned came down here and along here, and again you can see it's tracking railway lines. The idea obviously was to encircle forces which I presume the Ukrainians have in the Sumy area. Now, we can and will take a look at order of battle details to try and understand why they did it that way and where it came from. The real why is the same one that both the Germans and the Soviets had in World War II. They don't have enough trucks to support their forces, and neither side, but particularly not in World War II, the Germans have the logistics in terms of the POL to continue pushing their forces forward. Further south, encircling Kharkov and taking the city would actually be a huge loss to Ukraine, because the massive number of rail lines that go into the Kharkov area, and these maps, by the way, don't have all the rail lines, they have the key ones on it. But as you can see, there's multiple rail lines to the node in the city itself. That's really important if you're driving an offensive west, and more importantly, if you're driving one south. Now, we know from mapping that we've got in our possession that the Kramatorsk area is currently under threat. We know that Stalino has basically fallen, and please bear in mind, if we zoom this way out, you can actually see the amount of distortion in the map. So it's not that Kramatorsk is due north, it's actually to the west because of the way the mapping works of Stalino, right? It's actually about 30 or 40 miles west. Now that's quite important, because by taking Kharkov and then taking this rail line down here through Zaporozhye and all the way down to Melitopol and to link up with the forces here, the Russians could theoretically re-encircle the forces which have just broken out, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. Our Ministry of Defense here, and news articles in the Western press, are talking about withdrawing forces to economize in manpower, which either means they think the Ukrainians are trying to build some maneuver mass, in other words, a counter-attack force or a reserve, or just as likely they're as burnt out as the Russians are. Bear in mind that for both sides, fighting in cities is extremely costly, and you can see the built-up areas in the Donbass are actually extensive. We're not hearing about fighting, say, in Gorlovka or Konstantinovka or Artemvsk, right? We aren't hearing that. But I guarantee there's been fighting there. There has to have been. So I'll let that sink in. House-to-house fighting has not been limited to Mariupol. It's not been limited to any of the little towns over here. Every single one of these cities will have had to have been fought through. The damage will be extreme, because both sides will not be holding off whatever firepower they can bring to apply to try and save their own troops' lives and kill the bad guys. I'm not here to judge who's winning, who's losing in terms of the politics of it. I'm here to tell you the Ukrainian army is taking cataclysmic losses trying to hold this area here when the Russians could always encircle them, and they appear to have been doing that. You may notice that when we go back to this map here, the front line is now some way off the water here. That's really important when you look at this map, because this railway line here is now open and is now under Russian control. They have a high volume capacity to move stuff, for the most part, between Crimea and the Russian nation state as a whole over to the east. That does then start to ask what's next. If I were the Russians, I'd be looking to take Kharkov as a matter of priority, because it opens up a strike down on this arc here to Zaporozhye, and if you can do that, it will essentially break any Ukrainian forces in that entire area there. Sooner or later, Ukraine's going to run out of manpower. And the West can pump in as many weapon systems as we want. We aren't giving them what they really need. We will not give them what they need, which is our troops on their ground fighting their war. To be brutal, and this is another key point, a special military operation, which is what both sides are fighting here, is not a war. Even if we were allied to Ukraine, and there is some argument that we are, here in Britain and in the US, because I believe we guarantee their territorial integrity, this is not a war. There is no legal basis for the West to get involved. Horrible though that may be, it becomes a fascinating comparator to consider that to take this area in pink here, it's taken them roughly 4.5 to 5 months. Let's take a look at what the much more capable Soviet army did in World War II. And then we're going to show you something which may or may not actually help illuminate why the Russians are struggling so badly. So the strategic offensive that they planned initially was in multi-part stages. So you can see Kharkov is here, and you see Stalino is there. And you can see that the whole idea was always a double envelopment. Now the Germans stopped this dead. So that was in July and August of 1943. Further north, around Kursk, the Belgorod-Kharkov offensive, as you can see, smashes straight through, gets into a place called Garach. It's a tiny wee place. It's just a rail junction. The key point is it's got a bridge, and the Russians did grab the bridge. They also took Kharkov with a double envelopment, which is absolutely crucial, as we've discussed, because it opened up the rail net so they could logistically support forces as they move forward. This operation was essentially a month and a half. And it was done with well over 1 million men. Around 350,000 Soviet casualties were suffered, and about 150 to 200,000 German casualties. In the phasing of these operations here, and the ones we're about to show you, the Germans went from around 3,500 tanks available in the Eastern Front, as they would call it, down to a couple of hundred. There was no massive German victory. Their army was gutted trying to stop these offensives. In September, having already been stopped, and you can see when you compare this with that, the front line essentially didn't change. The Russians did blast through, and in a few days they rapidly moved forward to Stalino. They get stopped along the river line here at Mariupol. They punched through the whole of the Donbass and were racing forward, and the Germans counterattacked, chopped off their spearhead, and it stabilises somewhere along that line there for a short period of time. These maps here are straight out of the West Point Atlas. We can use them because they're open source and they're published through the Library of Congress in the USA, so thank you to the US government. So from the 17th of July all the way through to the 1st of December, which if you think about it, is 4 and a bit months, the Red Army moved forward in the north out of the Rizov area and round and about Orel, smashing forward to take this line here through Orsha. That doesn't really affect what we're talking about down in the south, but it's important to understand that that is not an insignificant distance. The primary offensives, however, were all down in the south here. They were able to take pretty much the same area they've taken just now in a period of 5 months. Further north, they had more success. Then again, the Germans pulled out quite a lot of assets to go to Italy, which people tend to forget. A lot of the better German units were pulled out because of the Allied invasion of Sicily and then operations in Italy. They took Kharkov and then they moved forward. They gained this line here, which includes Kiev, by December of 1943. Interesting. Is that outside your house? Is your car okay, Geoff?
I'll have a very quick look.
Yep. Go and have a wee look. I'll just leave it recording. It's not a problem, mate.
Someone else's car. And it's right next to the house that's occupied, so they can investigate.
Fair enough. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we'll come back to it in 3, 2, 1, go. Right, so by the 1st of December, the Germans had moved to this line, had been pushed back to this line here. They had, by the way, repeatedly counterattacked. And you can dig through Wiki, which actually got some pretty good articles. There's some really good books by people like David Glantz that explain all of this in great and tedious detail. And it's the kind of research that we're doing for Vengeance, so we can create scenarios that hopefully will enable people to play this. The important thing to remember, though, is the Germans have 1.1 million men down here to 1.2 million men, plus the Romanians have about 150,000. The Hungarians have got around the same number in that whole area. A lot of the second nation, if you like, forces were actually being used for rear area security, but it did free up a lot of German troops to keep on fighting. The Red Army attacked with between 2 and 5 million men. I think you'll find that the Russian army attacked with, what is it, between 10 and 15 battalion groups of 800 bubbas each. So they've gone in with around 85,000 ground troops and apparently roughly the same number of guys in the support echelon. 150,000 men to take on Ukraine is not that much, given the scope and the size of the place. So they're actually not doing too badly, if somewhat slower than many people would have expected in what they've achieved. The second phase of the Soviet offensive in World War II starts from this line here, which you may recall that it took them 5 months to get to. And these operations start in December of 1943, rolling on from the initial attacks, and move forward to the end of April in 44. So over a 9-month period, they liberate eastern Ukraine and central Ukraine and get into Romania. They actually take an absolute pounding at Iasi twice. They fail in repeated breakthrough attempts in these areas here, and they fail to stop and destroy 1st Panzer Army getting out of the pocket that they did create in this area, partly due to tremendous German air efforts, and partly, simply put, they had burnt their forces out. They didn't have the firepower to do it. So, to be clear, to get 2/3 of Ukraine took 9 months with a force which outnumbered his opponent by 2 to 3 or 4 times. In terms of the armour available, the Red Army started out at 6 times and ended up at 20 times the amount. Artillery was always at 5 to 10 times the number of gun tubes. I don't think the Russians are doing too badly when you start to look at that. When you look at this map, marrying this terrain in here merely gave the Russian army an opportunity to do what it does well. Fight old-fashioned, in inverted commas, artillery-heavy campaigns. And yes, you're quite right, Geoff, they are going to run out of gun tubes sooner or later. But if your opponent is 2,000 gun tubes in total, and they've been given about 250 more by NATO, whether it's a gift or sold, we aren't quite sure, because that seems to be kept very quiet. The Russians started this with 29,000 gun tubes on pieces. So my colleague Corey, who I think we'll introduce to you in the next video, He is a former US artilleryman, and he tells me the piece is the whole bit of kit you need to send a shell down range. He also tells me that pretty much every army on the planet tends to buy additional gun liners, so they can be reconditioned quite easily if you've got the right kit. The last time we looked, and to be fair, we are talking about 1939 to 1945, the primary place where the Reds could at that time reline tubes was Leningrad or in the Ural Mountains. The stuff in the Urals only went up to a certain caliber. Naval guns had to be done in Leningrad, and that's one of the reasons the Red Fleet was tied up for the bulk of the war after the fall of the Crimea in 1942. So, in summation, Ukrainian counterattacks have done something here that's very positive. They've regained control of the Kharkov rail node. Kharkov is a really important city, not just because of the railway. A, it's symbolic. B, it is a logistical hub. And C, not a lot of people know this, to borrow something from Michael Caine. It's actually the key location that produced the T-72 tank. So if you take a look at what everybody's fighting with, it seems to be T-72s. All the interesting stuff, the more up-to-date stuff, has not been seen. The Russians aren't using their good kit. One does wonder if the real reason they want these places Kharkov, because guess what, that's where they make tanks of that type. And Mykolaiv, down here in the south, right there, is really important, because that city is the primary shipbuilding area for military and civilian vessels in the Black Sea. So our Russian friends, who managed to carelessly lose a cruiser the other week there, as we all discussed the last time, probably want that city and the cruiser that's tied up there to replace their old one. Now, Geoff picked up on something, and he sent me this on Facebook. It's a guy called Rob Lee, and he's been following crowdfunding inside Russia. And I'm scrolling really fast down at the bottom of this because it's absolutely fascinating. We keep hearing that Ukraine needs equipment. We keep hearing that the Russians have equipment coming out their ears. Really? So we've got kit getting dumped into forces using a Ford Transit van, getting towed out by a total Land Cruiser because he's stuck in the sand. We've got some pictures of aviation units needing equipment which are being crowdfunded. Basic stuff, first aid kits, binoculars, cheap UAVs, little drones, assorted suppressors for his weapon. But all of that wasn't provided by the Russian government. It's actually been provided by the Russian public, clubbing together and buying stuff and sending it to the front. Kind of like what we've been doing in the West.
I'm beginning to wonder if some of that is a reaction to the corruption problem. There's a lot of reports of copper wires being taken from tanks, which renders them effectively mission killed until you can get some copper wiring back in. And a lot of low-level corruption, which will completely immobilize certain pieces of kit for I don't know, a couple of dollars profit on the part of the corruptor, as it were.
Yeah.
I begin to wonder if this is the Russian state is trying to organize a grassroots campaign, public campaign, to try and replace some of the stuff that should have been there but wasn't. There's also the separatist republics, who are not well equipped at all. I've been looking at, there's an Australian YouTuber called Bannerman, who's been looking at the equipping of the separatist republics. They really are equipped with the bona fide Mosin Nagants and what have you. Virtually no protective equipment whatsoever. I'd be very interested to see if this sort of public campaign is ever aimed towards them, because even though those troops are being used as sort of meat grinder shock troops in urban areas, as elucidated by Michael Kaufman, you still need them to have some equipment.
Yeah.
You don't want to run out of those troops at all. That is not
Absolutely
a good idea.
Not. The key thing also to remember is I have friends who fought in the Middle East for the British government, And they were going to buy sunglasses and sunscreen and decent socks and boots and so on, because our military isn't provided with that kit here, not to an adequate standard. So to some extent, every government has this problem. One of my friends serves in the US Army, and again, he buys kit for himself because he either can't get it or it's inadequate in terms of the quality and the capability. So I think there's a multiplicity of reasons for what we're seeing in this guy Rob Lee's Twitter feed, right? And to be honest, it's fascinating because some of this is fairly high-tech stuff. Some of it is really basic, you know, socks, some effectively makeup, you know, camel paint, that kind of thing. Some of it, forward air controller, radios and so on. But this is all sort of, you know, stuff that you and I can buy in a shop. We're not talking about military spec stuff. It doesn't frequency jump. Having this kind of kit on their equipment does start to beg questions about what happened to, quotes, the good stuff. Was it all sold? Was it all stolen? Was it all just basically binned because they couldn't afford to maintain it? We don't know. But this does tell you that one of the problems they have is a lack of equipment. And if the locals are using Mosin Nagants, we're actually back to the Eastern Front in World War II, but also the Eastern Front in World War I. Because not putting too fine a point on it, that's the standard rifle for the Imperial Russian Army and then the Soviet Army. The difference between the Soviet Army and the Imperial Russian Army, by the way, in terms of equipment, is not that great for the infantrymen. The one thing they do have is ZB-26, which is essentially the same as a Bren gun, as a light machine gun, very effective weapon. But other than that, it's the same kit. You know, all of this stuff is probably out of an old Soviet store cupboard somewhere. And I guarantee, because the Soviets didn't throw anything away, there's a hell of a lot more of that where it came from. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a cave somewhere that's got a shed load of T-34-85s in it. Given they made 66,000 of them, I can't imagine they'd have thrown them all away. I could be wrong, of course. So that is where we're at with Ukraine. Yes, it's going a little bit slower, quite a lot slower in some areas, but the bottom line is the Russians aren't losing. The Ukrainians are the ones falling back for the most part. And even if you accept that these have been fairly successful counterattacks here and down here and a little bit in that area, the basic war aim that Putin has banged on about has now been achieved. They now have an opportunity to drive that way and to drive back down this way to try and encircle Kharkov. Is it possible that as they refit all the stuff that went down to Kiev and then ran away, that that's going to get fed in here and change the dynamic? I don't think that's unreasonable. And certainly, if you were looking at that map thinking, well, where are we going to go? It'd be far better to look at the game map because there's a bit more details, got a bit more terrain on it. If you're looking at that and you know you've taken this whole tract in this area here, you want to come down here just to cut off the bad guy if you're the Russians. If you're the Ukrainians, you're now starting to get to critical core Ukrainian territory. Bear in mind that pretty much everything east of the Dnieper was traditionally and historically Russian. Ukraine, historically, is this area in here, down here. Okay? I'm not saying, by the way, that Putin was right to start this war. His excuses for it are pathetic. That all said, there is some case to be made that Russians should be ruled by Russians and Ukrainians by Ukrainians. Whether you like it or not, guys, this is not going away. What's worrying is our press is now more interested in Boris Johnson getting a BJ from his wife prior to their marriage, or assorted other scandals right round the world, whether it's the Roe v. Wade thing, Wade v. Roe thing rather, in America, or it's, you know, Sri Lanka being an economic freefall, All of these things have now overtaken the fact that Europe, for the first time since World War II, has a major war between two large nations raging. Call it special military operation all you want. This is a war. This is not going away. One side will win, and it isn't Ukraine. The unintended consequence, because there's a law of unintended consequences, Sod's law, Murphy's law, whatever you want to call it, is for the first time in their history, Finland up here and Sweden down here have applied to join and been accepted as part of NATO. Other than creating a huge land border with Russia all the way up here, yeah, along that dotted line, by the way, guys, that bit there was claimed by the Soviet Union at the end of the war, the Second World War. The bottom line is, guys, we now have a very long, difficult to defend border with Russia, comes all the way down through the Baltic states. Belarus, yeah, it's a country, honest gov. It's really a puppet state for Putin. So our border comes all the way down to there. If Ukraine falls, it goes all the way back down here. Moldova, this little snippet along the eastern edge here, along the river, is essentially Russian occupied. It's fascinating the Russians haven't tried to grab or put pressure on Odessa from it. I'm not quite sure why. Presumably they don't have that many troops. I've heard 1,500 men or something. You know, it's a regiment. It's not that much. I also know, because it's now been publicised, that the Ukrainians continue to fire rockets into Russia. I don't have a problem with that. They're fighting for their lives. They should be doing it. But people can't then howl when the Russians are doing that to the Ukrainians. So anyway, taking a wee look at our maps, you can see now from the rail net why they're interested in some of these places. And if you have to move everything by rail, and predominantly in Eastern Europe you do, you suddenly start to see identifiable thrust lines that actually match up with all these big offences going east or west. So when the Germans attacked, they came down this way, all the way down here, and then they cut round that rail line there to encircle the forces in the Kiev area. Going the other way, the Russians go that way, and then straight forward and smash through down here, and there's an encirclement here. Interestingly, history always seems to repeat itself in this area of the world, so our Russian friends are grabbing that bit there. That then creates another nice bite-sized pocket that they can take in here, and eventually Ukraine essentially crumbles internally because they just cannot handle that level of political catastrophe. Never mind the horrific loss of life and the, what is it, 9 million Ukrainians that have now left the country. You know, mostly they're women and children. No economy can take that hit and survive. So next time you guys gas up and you're complaining about $5 or $10 a gallon, or we're complaining here about £12 a gallon, it's £2 a litre here now, this is partly why. The other reason, simply put, is economic sanctions in parts of the Arab and the now failed socialist world in South America. So that's really all I've got to say about that. And what I'm going to do is hand you over to Jeffrey, who's got a little PowerPoint presentation he's going to run. We're going to start talking about battle cruisers.
Right. So, what is a battle cruiser? A battle cruiser has numerous definitions, but we can probably narrow them down to two fairly easily. The first is role, and the second is characteristics. So the first one, in terms of role, is it conducts trade interdiction. It will hunt down any commerce raiding cruisers. It can potentially interdict trade itself because it's very fast, has a lot of firepower and a lot of reach, especially once you get 12-inch gun ships, which can shoot about absolute minimum 15,000 yards, maybe 20,000 yards at a pinch. And it has the capability to maintain the to fly the flag of a nation in a peacetime visit that doesn't require a full-on battleship or carrier. But also, and quite crucially, it has the capability to stand in the battle line in a pinch. Now, that all of that is enabled by its characteristics. High speed, very good armament, high tonnage, and tonnage size is important. It allows you to have large stores, allows you to have quite decent range storing your fuel, and reasonably tough. But there are always trade-offs, and often the imagined weakness of the battlecruiser is low armor. Now, the one thing you get with the battlecruiser is that people often say battlecruisers had very thin armor, and therefore shells punched through, they blew up, and therefore it was a folly by Jackie Fisher. And obviously Jackie Fisher invented the battlecruiser, which is another thing that gets tallied around a lot. And ultimately we should never have tried this idea. And at its absolute extreme, the idea of a battlecruiser being weak to heavy shells is used as a sort of shorthand for the idea that the battleship itself was completely obsolete at the dawn of the 20th century. A lot of that, I think, is extremely wrong. So let me just show you how the battlecruiser first comes into being in terms of its characteristics and how we get to the modern battlecruiser of the First World War. So, first things first, it has to be kept in mind that a warship with high armament, decent speed and maneuverability, with certain other trade-offs, be it sometimes in size, sometimes in armor, that's actually been around for quite a long time. For a start, you can have the race-built galleons of the Elizabethan period, heavy guns, handles very well, can sometimes run rings around the Spanish galleons, which were much higher freeboard, generally had a pretty high armament, but weren't as maneuverable as the English race-built galleons. And then we can forward to the 64-gun ship of the line, to a lesser extent the 74-gun ship of the line, and at its most extreme, the Rezé frigate, which was essentially a high armament ship, so maybe 64, 74, cut off the top deck, leave as much heavy cannon in the lower decks as possible, and you've got something that's quite fast, has a nice big sail, so it's got good power sailing through the ocean. But
Geoffrey, you talking about the Rezés, I understand what they are.
Mm-hmm.
Would that compare with the 1812 second war with the USA between Britain and the US and American frigates?
Right.
Which are much bigger than the typical frigate built in Europe at the time.
Yes, there's that one as well. Yes. Where's that book? I wasn't expecting that one. I've got a wonderful book somewhere, and it's not on my bookshelf, and it's usually there. 6 Frigates, yes, with very good book by Pulitzer Prize winner. So yes, that also does count. Though keep in mind,
Old Ironsides. There's the Constitution.
Keep in mind that as I was talking about the Rezés, the example in my head was a Rezé chasing down one of those frigates.
Yeah.
So in a way, I'd actually say that the American frigates actually kind of close more to. I'm going to be very naughty here. I'm going to compare it to an armored cruiser, and then the Rezé chasing down that particular frigate, which I cannot remember which one exactly, is more akin to a battle cruiser chasing down the armored cruiser. But nonetheless, it's still the similar principle. You've got your heavies, you've got your fasts, and you want to get just enough design compromises to get something in the middle that can run away from that which is stronger and hopefully batter down that which is faster before it gets away. So we have all those sort of early modern predecessors, but I just want to get into now what's going on in the very late 19th century. So we're talking about 1880s, 1890s, up to the up to about 1900. You generally have the warships generally fight around 1,000 to 2,000 yards.
Right.
There are multiple reasons for this, but the first one that comes to my head, and hopefully you can see that little beginning of PowerPoint presentation. What the key thing is range finding. How can you spot far enough to shoot far enough? Can you spot at 6,000 yards? You know where the fall of shot is. You can correct your aim. Therefore, your guns can reach that far. When you look at a 12-inch gun from about 1890, or let's say 1900. It's about 12,000 yards it can fire out to minimum. But that's in ideal conditions. Often it's safer to fire it and waste this ammunition around 1,000 to 6,000 yards. So when we look at the Sino-Japanese War up to the Battle of the Yellow Sea, your 12-inch guns for the Russians and the Japanese, and to a lesser extent the Chinese, fire out to 6,000 yards. But the other thing is that a 12-inch gun, at this point, it can fire 1.3 shots a minute, or a shot every 1.3 minutes. It's practically irrelevant because it will run out of a ready supply of ammunition very quickly. There is a problem getting ammunition from the magazine up to the guns. You have to have quite a lot stocked in the turret at that point. So once...
Oh, interesting. Okay.
So, oh, sorry, you go.
And I'm fascinated that they actually used ready-use ammunition on the main armament of the pre-dreadnoughts. That is not something I was aware of.
Well, the thing is, a lot of this I got from Nav Weeps, and they are very reliable. And the fact is, 12-inch guns do run out very quickly, but so logically, you have to have a ready supply to fire off reasonably quickly, and then there has to be a distance in hauling the ammunition up. I could be completely wrong about this, but it's the only logical explanation why these guns suddenly run out of, suddenly slow down in fire rate so quickly. So, but with that, and it should be noted that when Jellicoe was looking at the firing rate of British ships at Jutland, he noted that the British firing rate with their nice new dreadnoughts, 12 to 13.5 inch and 15 inch and what have you, their firing rate was the same as the Japanese at Tsushima in their Mikasa, basically ersatz, majestic class pre-dreadnoughts. So it is possible to fire 12-inch guns reasonably quickly, but there must be some key limiting factor because they're relying on the 6-inch gun. For a lot, the British are relying on the 6-inch gun to carry them through any future engagement. That is why, when we look at something like the Mikasa, 4 12-inch, 14 6-inch.
Right.
And you can see that is a pretty nasty broadside right there. If you get to within 1,000 yards and you pour that into the less well-armoured parts of a battleship, that's pretty nasty. So yeah. It's assumed, and I must make it very clear, it is assumed that the 12 inches will not be able to interfere with a column coming close enough to do that. Now, it turns out that the Japanese do manage to make effective use of their 12 inches, so it's possible that it's improvements in magazine, getting stuff up from magazines, which allow them to do that. So to an extent, this is actually a very obsolete theory.
I can maybe update a little bit here. One of the things we did some research on for the naval side of our games, mostly for World War II, was taking a look at the cycle rate for a gun. And cycle rate for World War II heavy caliber weapons, that's essentially 11-inch and up in our book. So it's 11-inch, 12-inch, 13.5, 14, 15, 16, and 18. The cycle rate, depending on the Navy, is between 1 and 2 shells a minute. But bear in mind, that is with a huge amount of hydraulics, it's with a massive amount of automation, it's with all kinds of very fancy equipment to drag shells out of the magazine. It's got power ramming, but that power ramming can only be done at certain elevation angles. So when you see a picture of a battleship firing its guns at a high angle, it actually reduces its rate of fire because the gun barrel has to drop down to almost horizontal so it can ram the 1 or 2 ton shell into the weapon, just to give you some sort of idea. Now, because the Royal Navy emphasised rate of fire, the upgrades to the guns done, and I think it may have been either during or before or just after World War One, meant that a 15-inch did have a cyclical rate of fire sustained at 2 rounds per minute.
Yes.
Right? Now, that is very high for a battleship. The US Navy's 14-inch gunships were lucky to get 1 round a minute. And our source for that is Campbell's Naval Weapons and the NaveWeps website, amongst other things, just to give you an idea. So that 1 to 2 round a minute thing is not unusual and is not unreasonable. Where things go wrong is with something called drill. And the more complicated your protection systems are, because you can get flashbacks which go into a magazine and blow up the ship. And it did happen on occasion, once or twice. Just simply put, someone made a mistake and something went bang, and that's catastrophic when it blows up 200 or 300 tons of high explosive. The bottom line basically is the more protection you put in, the more chances there are that a adequately trained rather than superbly trained crew are going to muck up the drill, and then you start to lose output, which is what the Navy calls lobbing shells downrange. So a ship which has got bad drill, in other words, the crew's not adequately trained, may only come up to 40 or 50% of its total theoretical firepower. And that's as long as we're long later than this. It's 40 or 50 years later. So just to kind of give you some idea, this is still a thing in World War II. And in fact, it's the thing right now with the move by the Americans away from a swing arm, right, which takes a missile, drops into right angle, fires it for anti-aircraft defense, or vertical launch system. The reason they meant VLS, which by the way is much harder to re-munition at sea, the reason they went for VLS is you get a higher rate of fire against multiple incoming targets. Just a little thought. Sorry, Geoff, I just thought I would highlight that for people because this is really interesting stuff.
No, it's fine. Because the other thing I was going to say was, there's one, I think it's a Majestic. I think the Majestic class battleship, at one point, the first few have one turret type. The second, I think it's the fourth of that class, and then the fifth has another turret type.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final one has a third turret type. Now, the second turret type for the second batch has inferior flash protection to the first and third turret types.
Right.
Which interests me. Is it possible they were mucking around with different ways of getting shells up as quickly as possible and to get the guns up and down?
That would make sense.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, that by World War One, the more up-to-date ships, and certainly anything built for the Second World War, it's a continuous chain. It's like a bicycle chain, but really big, with buckets on it, which lug the shells up. And there's a separate one of those for the cordite charges that you use to actually send the shell downrange. And both of these chain systems tend to either be continuous or a broken chain, depending on the builders and the designers. The idea being that obviously if you get shells in a continuous chain, you've got a link between the magazine and the turret, and flash can go down that link, and flash can then potentially explode the shells in the magazine. So they tended to have safety interlocks on it, which put some kind of a flash protection screen in place whilst things were being fired up above. I understand that it's a non-continuous chain is preferred for the cordite charges going up to the turret. Absolutely. And I suspect there would have been some kind of change in the protection between these different turrets. And flash protection is much more important for effectively the powder magazine, if you like, than it is for the main armaments magazine. And actually, if you take a look at one of the big changes between the two wars, pre-World War One, most ships were designed with the powder magazine above the shell magazine.
Yeah.
They switched that round because, interestingly, it's a lot harder to blow up a shell than it is to blow up the powder. Back to you, Geoff.
Right. Well, with all of that, why am I faffing on about pre-dreadnoughts when I should be talking about battle cruisers. Well, with all of this, no matter how fast the gun can fire, it means that for a short time there is this perception, at the absolute least, there is this perception that the 12-inch gun is more of a support weapon than a primary weapon. This means that pre-dreadnoughts have this, their 6-inch guns are almost a sort of semi-primary weapon. Now, very quickly, this explains why you've got so many different calibers on the pre-dreadnoughts, because then you can have a secondary that's more powerful and a secondary that's less powerful to offer support to your 6 inches. And once you're in extreme range, you can get, extreme point blank range, 1,000 yards, what have you, then you may find yourself coming into lots of threats from torpedo boats. So you need lots of different calibers to provide as many firing arcs and as much firepower as possible as torpedo boats get closer to your ship. You get to the point where they've got 3-pounder guns in the firing tops, almost firing vertically downwards to try and hit the decks of torpedo boats. So there's a lot of that with a pre-dreadnought. But let's just get to the cruiser, because what is the armament of a cruiser compared to a pre-dreadnought roughly in this era? So you've got the Majestic, early 1890s. You've got the Cressy, 5 to 10 years later. But the thing is, a Cressy has very similar tonnage to a Majestic. It's not 7,000 tons, it's 12,000. I think the Powerfuls were about 7,000 tons. So we've seen a massive leap in terms of protected armor cruiser tonnage. It's also got 12 6-inch guns. A Majestic has 12 6-inch guns. It's also got 2.6-inch armor belt, and the Majestic has 9-inch belt armor. So you're reaching the point where, in a period where the Royal Navy is sort of umming and ahhing over the viability of big gun armament, in the minds of some of them, you could say that a Cressy has the same primary armament as a Majestic. According to Friedman, this is the point where the battlecruiser is effectively invented, the modern battlecruiser.
It should be noted that the Cressy class armoured cruiser is 5 knots faster than the equivalent battleship.
Mm-hmm.
That is getting into the same speed differential that Dreadnought and Invincible have. And we'll come back to Invincible shortly. So Dreadnought is 20 odd knots, 21 knots. Invincible, the first major battle cruiser designed under the Royal Navy, which is designed as a big gun battle cruiser, is 25.5 knots. Just a little point. This is why Geoffrey's really catching on to these two ship designs, because as you can see, they're very comparable.
If you ever pull up, there's a particular photo which I wanted to get, but I didn't have time to find, of two ships at Malta, and I honestly think it is a Cressy and a Majestic, and you'll see that a Cressy looks long, it looks big, and a Majestic is sort of much more squat and shorter. To the uninitiated, you could almost sort of confuse which is the cruiser and which is the battleship. Now, with all of this, we then move forward to the final pre-dreadnought, the Lord Nelson class, and one of the last armoured cruiser, the Minotaur. Again, 4,600 long tons, 14,000 long tons for the Minotaur, 15,000 for the Lord Nelson. The Minotaur has two 9.2-inch guns with 10 7.5-inch. The Lord Nelson has two 12-inch and 4 twin and then 2 single 9.2-inch. I'd say that's in some ways at this point they've reached the point where the 12-inch gun, they've either managed to improve the firing rate significantly. They have absolutely managed to really start thinking about improving the range through better range finding. So you can definitely at this point stand off and plink your enemy with 12-inch shells, and the 6 inches, according to the Royal Navy, are not useful in a long-range fleet action. So we are reaching the point where the idea of the 6-inch battleship is not credible. But at the same time, you've still got this big tonnage. You've got 9.2 inch, so it's only a few inches short from a 12-inch. If you swap out a lot of those 7.5 inch guns and the 9.2 inch and plonk a couple of 12-inch guns in that Minotaur, now, obviously from a design perspective, that probably wasn't possible. But if you design a ship specifically to have 12-inch whilst having 23 knot speed compared to an 18 knot pre-dreadnought, you're reaching the point where you do have what is the classical battlecruiser. Very, very close. Now, very quickly, just before I say anything else, let's look at the armor belt. Minotaur has 3 to 6 inch. Lord Nelson has 12-inch. That is kind of the standard you get from this point on. You do get battlecruisers having lesser armor than a battleship. I will come back to that in a moment and say why that is not necessarily a crippling flaw. Let's just move on just to look at the engagement rates are at Jutland. The initial ranges at Jutland, you've got battlecruiser Lion, 18,500 yards with her first salvo. Tiger, 18,500. Princess Royal, 16,000. New Zealand, 18,000, etc., etc. And the Germans, again, 17,000 for Von der Tann and Letzo, 16,800 yards. So it is a massive leap up from the long range 6,000 yards at Tsushima. You've really got to build ships with 12-inch guns by this point. The 6-inch thing has been discredited. But when we get to what battlecruisers look like now, Invincible, 17,200 long tons. Dreadnought, 18,000 long tons. It's exactly the same characteristic as we saw with Cressy and Majestic. It's not that much of a difference in terms of tonnage. There's a lot of stuff you can pack in there. Water condensers, electrical generators, etc., etc. But they've swapped out the smaller guns, the battlecruiser. They're some very nice 12-inch guns right there for Invincible and Dreadnought.
The key difference when you actually dig into the two ships in a bit more detail is the armor plan.
Mm-hmm.
So the primary belt on Invincible is only 6 inches because she was designed to hit and run against heavy ships. She was not intended to sit slap by in the battle line. She could for a while, but that wasn't her primary role. If you take a look at the difference in firepower between a 12-inch gun and a 9-inch gun, it's quite significant. So I'm just very quickly looking up a couple of numbers here. To give you some idea, I just checked this, a 9.2-inch round weighs 172 kilograms. So that's about 5 or 6 good-sized suitcases. A 12-inch round is 385 kilograms. So you're chucking something that's twice the size at your target. All of that said, it makes the Invincible able to kill anything smaller than it quite easily. And the other issue is that the Royal Navy, for some reason, refused to look at upgrading and updating its boiler technology until quite late on. So to get the increase in power that Invincible needs to get 25 knots as opposed to the 21 knots of Dreadnought, it actually took up a lot of hull space and tonnage, which is something that is kind of hard to understand, given there were ships being built at that time, the Lusitania, the Aquitania, that could sustain 28 knots for an extended period of time in a transatlantic run, because they had better boiler technology, but the Navy wouldn't do it. So if you want more speed, unfortunately, something has to give. So you either make the ship bigger, and finances said no, or you cut weight. You'll notice one turret less on the main armament, which is quite a lot of weight. It's about 1,000 tons, maybe 2,000 tons.
Pretty much.
And frankly, more engine power means a bit less armor. But that extra speed means you can run away from Dreadnought if you're Invincible. You know, if it's an adverse tactical situation, it is not a dead loss. And the other thing is, the loss of Invincible, when you dig into it, was caused by drill error. In other words, people were leaving the flash protection open. So a penetrating hit, which caused the flash, went down the trunk and blew up her magazine. Stupidity killed that ship, not a hit.
Well, this is the thing to get into, because you look at, because the big problem when people talk about loss of battlecruiser, they go, Invincible, Queen Mary, Hood, blew up, ha ha. Now, you look at what happens at Dogger Bank. BT's in Lion, and he selects Seydlitz as his target. So you have, and I'm just going to stop sharing. I'll try and there we go, and slideshow. Right. So I'm good. Here we go. So you've got the the Germans are sailing along in the battle cruisers. They've tried to do a little raid, and it hasn't worked. And they've seen the British, and they're sailing along, and then the British try to sort of sail along parallel to each other. Now, Lion selects the flagship, selects Seydlitz, the other flagship, as his target. Then down there you have Pelly and Lion, which should select Moltke as its target. It doesn't. It selects the next ship down. This therefore means that you've got two battle cruisers on the German side, one of which is not being suppressed by fire. So they get to open fire on Lion. Lion gets pasted. Absolutely crippled, frankly. She does not blow up. She's perfectly capable of taking a serious amount of damage. Her armor plating is relatively thin, but it is laid out well enough. And most crucially, there's not cordite lying around all over the place waiting to be exploded. Now, when we get to Jutland, the key problem is that BT is appalled by the shooting of his ships. The first and second battlecruiser squadron do not have the opportunity to practice their gunnery because they're bottled up in, I think, Rosyth, and they have to sail out a single harbour entrance multiple times to go anywhere. The Grand Fleet is at Scapa Flow. They can do their secondary training, secondary 6-inch, whatever, training inside Scapa Flow, and they can just sail out multiple entrances and do their big gun practice on the open sea. So that means their gunnery is going to be pretty good. But BT is absolutely fretting about the fact that his ships failed to hit anything at times at Dogger Bank. I think, was it Tiger made about 3 hits on the German battlecruisers, but the German battlecruisers made about 23 hits on Lion. And I can't quite remember, but it's not very good. So BT is wondering, how do we improve our gunnery? And Chatfield, his captain, goes, well, we've obviously got to shoot faster. You shoot faster, you'll make more hits, and therefore you can work out which hits hit, and therefore you correct your aim. Instead of slowly trying to get the range, and then once you've got the range, you fire faster. This obsession with firing fast first, shooting from the hip basically, means that they don't do very well in gunnery practice, which means naturally BT goes, well, we've got to fire even faster. Eventually that accumulates to the point where the crews are going, we've just got to store cordite in the turrets, maybe in the hallways, the access passages. There are special protective boxes embossed into the floor of the turret that they leave open. And that means that when Invincible is firing and firing and firing against Jutland, single hit goes in, hits a turret, gets inside the turret, there's an explosion, there's fire that goes down into the magazine, there's fire that goes down perhaps into the corridors. It doesn't matter. Just fire goes throughout the ship and it explodes.
That picture there is Invincible taken just as she explodes. That's what happens when cordite goes bang. Now, that's actually somewhat different to what happens later on in Life to Hood. It's her main armament magazine that goes bang. That's a cordite fire, which then triggers more catastrophic damage to the ship and sinks it. The key points, though, if you take a little look at her armour plan, though, yes, her belt is not great. It's only 6-inch, and her decks are up to about 2.5 inch. That 2.5 inches, by the way, is over what we're seeing at the time as key elements of the ship. So that is the main machinery spaces, and our magazines. The problem was the upper part of our turrets actually doesn't appear to be all that thick. The forward face of the turret is 7 inches, but I don't know what the lid, as it were, of the turret is. Now, that's not a piece of information I have immediately to hand. If someone wants to ask a question, please do in the comments below this. I can find that out, or Jeffrey can find that out. We can give you an answer. It's probably in Campbell's about turret design. It'll be in there somewhere, I would imagine. I'm going to compare her directly with the Goeben class. The Goeben and the Molt class battle cruisers are roughly the same age, slightly more modern. For German ships, they got more compartmentalization, so that's a bit harder to sink. But their armor belt is between 3 and 11 inches. Right? That's the same as Dreadnought. So they actually have more protection against the shell coming in largely horizontal. The deck is between 1 and 3 inches, which is comparable with the Royal Navy. She's no more proof against a plunging shell coming in at a steep angle than Invincible is. So to say that the British battle cruisers are flawed design, guess what? The German ones have much the same flaw. And as we move forward through the years, one of the things I'm going to run people through and try and compare ships. You're going to see some really interesting statistics suddenly come out of this. Early battle cruisers designed by the British are really large armoured cruisers because the Minotaur class's armour plan is very similar to that for Invincible and her immediate successors. But later on, with the exception of Renown and Repulse, which were built very light and very fast, generally speaking, the battle cruisers get more and more armour plate, they get more powerful engines, and they get bigger guns. Kind of just like a battleship. The real difference from my perspective is the Germans went down a slightly different route in that they made the ships a lot harder to sink with torpedoes by compartmentalizing. But if you could get a penetrating hit into a magazine or whatever, and the barbettes and so on are much the same as the British ones, 9 inches, guess what? Kind of the same. They're just as vulnerable to that plunging fire. Something which we'll come back to in World War II a bit later on, because I have a little thing I want to talk to you all about the Battle of North Cape. So, sorry to interrupt, Jeffrey, but I thought it might be useful to actually show people some hard numbers on 2 ships which essentially were direct competitors.
No, it's fine. It's fine. The one thing I will say is that there's one British battle cruiser which gets hit in the turret explodes, and she doesn't go up, and it's Lion, and Lion's captain has refused to have cordite spread all over the ship. So, frankly, if you look at the losses at Jutland, if every ship had sort of followed Lion's captain rather than Lion's admiral, Beatty, then, to be perfectly flipping honest, you'd get maybe fewer ships lost. The interesting thing is, the Germans lost a ship which was Lutzow, and they lost Lutzow because Invincible landed a critical hit, which slowly crippled her over time, and she eventually had to be lost. I think there was a piece of hull plate that was bent open, and then the more Lutzow steamed, the more that hull plate was peeled open by the force of water, and eventually her pumps couldn't handle it.
Yeah, which is kind of similar to what happened to Titanic in some ways. You know, it creates a progressive failure of the watertight integrity of the ship, and eventually she sinks. Or you have to scuttle her.
Exactly.
It's something which does happen. After these first and early generation battle cruisers, there are 2 ships which really catch my mind, because these are really fast battleships by the end of World War I. Those are the Admiral class HMS Hood, which blew up in engagement with Bismarck in the Second World War, and there's the York class, if you like, of battle cruisers. Now, none of these were actually built, but they were in construction at the end of World War I. The key thing is we do have the statistics. So the main belt is, again, 4 inches up to just under 12 inches. The deck is between 1.2 and 3.1 inch. She's got 8 15-inch guns. She's got a bunch of 6-inch guns to kill destroyers and torpedo boats. And her turret's 10 inches worth of armour. The armour plan is very conservative, and actually, if you compare the York class to Bismarck and Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and Tirpitz, there is very little difference in the armour plans. Something I have done, and I don't have time to actually dig through here. So let's take a look at Hood. Now, Hood's really badly maligned. She's a big ship, 42,000 tons. The Germans did this in 33,500 tons, by the way. But she doesn't have the range. And realistically, she's quite a bit slower than Hood, at least in theory. The bottom line is that the Admiral class are fast battleships. They are not battle cruisers. We lost Hood because of bad luck and a really stupid decision in Gibraltar. So Hood's belt is between 6 and 12 inches. Well, it's the same as the York class, and she's a ship of the same age. The deck is up to 3 inches. It's exactly the same. And her turret's 11 to 15 inch. That's actually more armour than the Germans have in the ships. To compare Hood with a very successful fast battleship design, that's the Queen Elizabeth's, we've got something here which is really interesting. The belt's 13 inches, so it's consistent. But Hood was much longer, and they decided to protect important parts of the ship and midships. That's the 2 magazines forward and aft, and it's all the machinery in the middle of the ship. Yeah, I'll get to that. So the deck on the Queen Elizabeth is between 1 and 3 inches. It was upgraded, by the way, after Jutland to between 4 and 6 inches over magazines. That's the only major change. When they rebuild the ships, it does change again. The turrets and the barbettes are identical to HMS Hood. So why is Hood seen as a failure? There is no real reason for people to say that she is an absolute failure. She is very similar in capability to the Queen Elizabeth class. She's a little bit faster. In fact, she's quite a bit faster. She's designed for essentially 28 knots, but actually she did attain something in the region of 32 knots originally. That was down to about 30 knots during the Second World War. So that's the Hood class. Is that a battle cruiser, or is it actually a battleship? It's got more armour than any of the earlier battle cruisers. She's as fast or faster than any of them. She's got more firepower. And had somebody not bothered ripping off these 2 small anti-aircraft guns and put a twin 4.5-inch turret right there by cutting a hole in her deck armour to get to a magazine which they installed right here, directly adjacent to the 15-inch one. It is believed that's where the shell penetrated, went straight through that hole that was cut. That's going to kill any ship that's had that done. It's just bad luck. It should also be noted that after that engagement, and after the following engagements between the ongoing engagement with Prince of Wales and then King George V and Rodney, there is damage to Bismarck that no one can understand how it got there. One might suggest that Hood actually hit her a couple of times, which suggests some incredibly good quality gunnery, until you realise she actually had centimetric forward radar that was slaved so she could actually point her guns. Bismarck's gunnery falls apart. We'll come back to that. I have a theory, and it's just a theory. So, we've got past the early ones. They get thin armour. We're now on to something which is basically a battleship. But our American cousins built the Lexington class. Only 2 of them were completed, both as aircraft carriers. The idea was to put 16-inch guns on it to outgun anything faster or slightly heavier. These things were 33-knot ships. The Americans wanted speed. They're on a 43,500 ton displacement. So we're now way above the initial 17.5 to 20,000 tons of the German-British ones right at the beginning of World War I. To get that speed, even with some pretty impressive technology with turboelectric drive, which is lighter, more modern design techniques, an all-or-nothing armour plan, which means the armour only protects those parts of the ship perceived as critical. The belt is between 5 and 7 inches, so it's pretty much the same as the early battle cruisers. And the deck is between 1.5 and 2.25 inches. The Americans chose not to build these because they had better ships in construction in their mind for their purposes. They built battleships which were slower with a bit more armour. But the bottom line basically is, these never-built battlecruisers are essentially invincible with 16-inch guns on a bigger hull to get the speed. Because the length and the shape of a hull determines the speed. And if you take a look at top-downs, you know, some ship moored, and you see Hood, and then you see her beside a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, they're much broader in relation to their length than the Hood is. They are probably the same beam. It just looks a little bit different. The US Navy was extremely sniffy about Britain's battlecruisers after all three of them blew up at Jutland. We've just identified that it's very poor training and drill that means high explosives are left lying about a turret, and if something goes wrong, it's going to go bang. That would sink any ship. And it might be worth pointing out that the Japanese lose the Matsu during World War II. The Americans almost lost one of their Iowa-class battleships not that long ago before she was decommissioned with a turret explosion. This can affect anybody. Unstable explosives, poor drill, stuff left lying about that shouldn't be, and you get a flashback and bang. Or something penetrates and goes boom, you get an even bigger boom. Right? So, during the run-up to World War II, the US Navy started to build a lot of big ships. They built treaty battleships. The South Dakotas, for example, they've got 16-inch guns, they've got quite a lot of armour. They're relatively quick, 28 knots. I'm not going to look at them because the US Navy didn't like any of them. They didn't retain them in commission after the war. They were laid up and then scrapped. Let's take a look at a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser. She's got 8-inch guns, not 12 or 11 or 14 or 16-inch. So she's what they called a heavy cruiser. That didn't mean well armoured. It just meant it's got a fairly big main gun and is pretty damn quick. So she is a 33-knot ship, starting to ring bells with the Lexingtons. Her armour is 4 to 6 inches on the belt, and her deck is 2.5 inches. Well, by anybody's sort of polite way of putting it, at 13,500 tons, she's a heavy cruiser, isn't she? Yeah? That's exactly what that is. Now, the US also heard that the Japanese were building a very large cruiser design, essentially a commerce raider, and they were aware that the Germans had 11-inch armed heavy cruisers of the Deutschland class, and they had Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which some sources claim are battleships. They're not, they're battle cruisers. They're not big enough, they're not heavy enough, and they certainly don't have the main armament of a battleship. And indeed, the German Navy basically told them, don't engage a battleship. Right? It doesn't go well. Well, guess what? It didn't for Scharnhorst at North Cape for a whole variety of reasons. So the Americans came up with a large cruiser design called the Alaska class. And this is where what's a battle cruiser and what a battleship starts to become, in my view, a lot clearer. So we're actually going to do a straight comparison between this Baltimore. It's definitely a cruiser. It's got 8-inch guns, not that much armour, very fast. So now we're at 29,500 tons. So twice the size of the Baltimore. We've got 12-inch main armament. But everything else is the same for anti-aircraft capability. This is why they only built 2 of them, and they were laid up and then scrapped fairly quickly after World War II. The belt was 5 to 9 inches, so a bit more armour than the Baltimore's. That, by the way, 9-inch is the same as Renown and Repulse after their first upgrade after World War I. So it's the same as a battlecruiser, guys. The armour deck's 3.8 to 4 inches. Well, you know what? That's comparable with some of the battleships. But this was part of the American concept that plunging fire had to be protected against more, and bear in mind there was a high risk of airstrikes from dive bombers. Big bombs need a lot of armour. But fundamentally, that armour deck is no different to most of the battle cruisers, particularly if they were upgraded. Renown and Repulse do actually go up to 3 to 4 inches of deck armour when they're heavily rebuilt in the 1930s. The US Navy said these are large cruisers. They call them CB, Charlie Bravo, right? Charlie Bravo 1 and 2, I believe. Interestingly enough, if you reverse it, you get BC, Bravo Charlie, and that is everybody's name for a battle cruiser. I submit that one of these Alaska class up against a proper fast battleship would not last all that long. If we compare with the Scharnhorst, built roughly 10 years before, between the wars, she's got 13 or 14 inch main belt. Her deck is 2 to 3.7 inch and she's got 9 11-inch guns. It's directly comparable with Alaska's, except for a bit more belt armour. She's roughly the same size, 32,100 tons. And her 11-inch cannon, although not quite as good as the much more modern 12-inch, admittedly, because Scharnhorst 11-inch are basically a development for World War I gun, as we're about to find out, this is on a very, very different scale to what you find on a treaty battleship. So the King George V class, which actually has a bit of a bad reputation because of the drill problems with these big quadruple turrets that they put on them, you'll see very rapidly why the German Navy really didn't want a Scharnhorst class battle cruiser to get into fight one of these things. There are long tons. Standard. Now, I can tell you right now, every last one of the KGVs was completed after an escalator was put in, more armour was added, and much more in terms of creature comforts, radar, etc. were plugged onto these ships because of the thought that the Yamato class were somewhat bigger than anybody else had actually come up with at that time and were breach of the treaty. Yeah? They've got 10 14-inch guns, so that's a dramatic firepower improvement over the 9 11-inch, or frankly the Alaska class's guns. Okay, we're not as quick here. The speed is 28 knots. So both the Germans at 32 knots and the Americans at 33 knots can run away. But to run away, you have to avoid getting hit. And the British battleships, by this point, have centrometric fire control systems. They have some of the world's most advanced fire control computers and so on board the ships. And if they get the range, they will hit you. They've got a more powerful shell. They outrange you. They've got a proper deck armament, 4-point armour, 4.88 to 5.88 inches. The main belt's almost 15 inches. In short, the comparatively small guns on the Scharnhorst and the Alaskas cannot compete with this ship. But what's really interesting is the Royal Navy had 2 terms for the King George V class. One was battleship. Some people called them fast battleships. 28 knots is pretty quick for a barrel wagon. But the official designation in most Admiralty documents is battle cruiser. These were not seen as battleships. They were seen as fast battle cruisers with heavy armour protection. Might be because they only had 14-inch cannon instead of 15 or 16-inch. I don't know. I'm aware that between the wars, the British wanted to build 16-inch armed battle cruisers with roughly that armour plan. And they wanted to build 18-inch battleships with even more armour. They were never built because of the London Naval Treaty. If we then go back time to the Japanese Congos, the Congo was a British battlecruiser design. It was built in Britain. She was upgraded to Japan. So she starts out with, bearing in mind, the Alaska class is a much newer ship. So the Congos start out with 8 to 11 inches of armour, which is more than the Alaskas. between 1.5 to 2.3 inches of deck armour, not quite as much, but I know they double it when they refit her and bring her up to battleship standards. She's a 30-knot ship most of her life, and she's got 14-inch guns, 8 of them. These ships here are not battle cruisers once upgraded, but they were a battle cruiser to begin with. So the Alaskas are definitely battle cruisers, guys. It's not a battleship, and it's certainly not a heavy cruiser. The Americans built another ship design, and our friends across the Atlantic love the Iowas. They're very attractive looking ships, which by American standards are quite rare. Some of them, many American designs, are functional rather than attractive. They've got a lot of firepower. They're fast. They're very big. They're almost 50,000 tons as built. And that's a pretty big ship. That's another 8,000 tons above the KGVs and above the Hood and above Bismarck. And bear in mind that Bismarck was seen as the most powerful battleship in the world until we found out after the war what a Yamato class could pack in terms of punch at least. So these things here, the Iowas, have a 12-inch belt. They've got deck armour at between 1.5 and 6 inches. They're not any better than a KGV. In fact, they're actually less well armoured. And I'd actually suggest, given her 16-inch guns and the fact she was designed not to be proof against her own cannon, she is much closer in concept to the Hood class, or more likely actually the Invincibles and the Lion and the Queen Mary and so on and so forth and the Tiger, than to the much heavier protection of the KGVs or the Montana class that was never built. They were designed to be proof against their own guns, and actually KGVs were designed to be proof against 16-inch. The Iowas possibly wouldn't have done very well in a battle against something with a big gun and decent fire control. Given her very, very high speeds, she was an ideal carrier escort. Lots of anti-aircraft firepower, big cannon to scare off anything smaller, and she could stand in the battle line long enough against a Yamato class with his 18-inch cannon to at least allow the carriers to escape and launch airstrikes. Fortunately for the American crews, in my view, the Iowas never actually had to do that. And if you look at their armour plan, which we don't have time to do tonight, but we'll maybe do that if people are interested, they're not that clever. And I'm sure Jeffrey's going to hit you with a huge rant about that's a battleship, John, it's not a battle cruiser. I disagree. Because this is actually a battleship by everyone else's sort of way of thinking. The Bismarck. Bismarck, Tirpitz, their sister ships, slight differences, but basically it's the same ship. She is a 30-knot ship. She's 42,000 tons. She's the same size as the KGVs. She's the same size as Hood in terms of tonnage. She's got 12-inch armour on her belt. And she's got deck armour 3.9 to 4.7 inches. She's very heavily compartmentalised. They took a hell of a lot of torpedoes and probably her own scuttling charges to sink her. She was, to be fair, reduced to scrap metal by the Royal Navy in the second engagement. And when you see pictures of the damage to her superstructure and so on underwater that we can now go and see with these submersibles, that people go and look at her, she was absolutely pummeled. What, however, is interesting is when you then go back to Scharnhorst and her engagement against Duke of York. Duke of York engaged at 17,000 yards, and most of the engagement was at point-blank range for the Royal Navy, 10,000 yards or less. Scharnhorst started to pull away, having been pummeled a couple of times with British cruisers. Her forward radar was out of action. The first salvo inbound from Duke of York does appear to have taken out the remainder of the radars. Her gunnery was at best patchy, possibly because of lack of training, possibly just because the damage had affected the director control systems. It's hard to say. Certainly Bismarck's gunnery goes to hell in a handcart very quickly in the engagements with the Royal Navy, and I think there's strong evidence to suggest that the multiple penetrating hits that she took also caused shock damage, which may well have affected her optical aiming systems. We do know that Bismarck's radar was on the blink, which is why Prince Eugene was in fact in front of her at the beginning of the debacle when Hood blew up. Scharnhorst was, frankly, a very successful ship design. She was a good commerce raider. She was quick enough to get away from most of the battleships she would come up against. She had adequate firepower to deal with anything smaller. In short, she ticks all the battle cruiser things. When she was lost, the Royal Navy claim a probable, that's 10, 14-inch hits, predominantly in the after part of the ship. And all of a sudden, her speed goes down. Now, aficionados of the Kriegsmarine will tell you, oh, she wasn't penetrated. Really? So why is it that her own ship's log and the people who got out of her engineering spaces and survived, not that many, I have to say, actually talk about sudden, massive battle damage, penetrating hits from a British heavy ship? The only British heavy ship engaged was the Duke of York. She hammered the Scharnhorst. We will do a proper presentation in the Battle of the North Cape at some point, and we can actually game that. We'll try and video it, gaming it, using our system. The Germans had 2 battle cruisers and 2 battleships. The Americans definitely had battle cruisers, but those ships were not necessarily the ones that you might think, in my view. And there is no problem having a ship which is a battle cruiser, as long as you use her right and upgrade her in the right ways, so that when things do go wrong and you have to fight something heavier, you can either run away or stand in the line long enough to do sufficient damage to the other guy to tell him to go home. Geoff has already told us the primary losses in World War I were due to high explosive flying about a turret. Penetrate that turret, get lucky, hit the turret, get a shell in there, the whole thing goes bang. Hood, armour plan is changed on an emergency basis to give her more anti-aircraft capability right before the battle with Bismarck. Had she not been blown up, she would have got something called a major repair. That would have meant stripping this ship down to that level there, replacing all her equipment in here, all the engines. There have been armour plan changes. The anti-aircraft armament is going to be completely revised. You would get a new superstructure, albeit probably not the full-blown job that was done on some of the older ships between the wars, because, let's face it, we're fighting a war. And the intriguing thing was her machinery that had been ordered went to sea in 1946, powering HMS Vanguard. So Hood actually lived on, in theory, for a while after her loss. I'm going to have to draw this evening to a wee bit of an early close. I just heard a massive thump from the facility, which leads me to believe my 84-year-old mother may just have fallen, guys. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Jeffrey to have another wee chat with you and make sure everything's okay. So I'm going to pop away for 2 minutes. We'll leave this in it so you know that we are real people. I certainly hope you found some of this informative and interesting. And I also hope that what you're getting from this is that when we create our product, we're not creating it based upon us going, the wind's blowing that way, it's that way. We look at this in depth. We try and give you the best product we can. So if you've enjoyed it, like and share it. Put comments in down below and subscribe to our feed. There'll be more coming soon. There'll be more updates from Bob, our head programmer. And I'm sure Jeffrey's going to have a wee chat with you for another couple of minutes. I'll be back in 2 seconds, just making sure that everything's okay. So guys, thank you very much. I'll see you in 2 minutes. Jeffrey, please knock them dead. And you can then tell them why the Iowa is a battleship. And I'm absolutely wrong, of course.
Right. Okay, then. So, having gone through all of that, I will try and add some extra stuff concerning the sort of what one could say is the 2-second lives of the battlecruiser. When you have the creation of the first fleet carriers, that is an aircraft carrier that is the largest type of aircraft carrier that is designed to serve on fleet operations. you get the development of the Lexington aircraft carrier. What is the Lexington aircraft carrier built over? The hull of the Lexington battlecruiser. So thus what you get is the creation of a ship which has very high armament in the form of its aircraft, very high speed, but as a ship which is designed to fight in the Pacific and put out a maximum air group and therefore doesn't have much room for a heavy internal armor plan, is relatively low on armor. So you could argue that the Lexington battlecruiser being converted into a fleet carrier, it still retains a certain characteristics of a battlecruiser: high speed, high firepower, relatively low armor. This therefore aids it in its mission, its function, where it can scout for the fleet like a battlecruiser can. It would have good anti-commerce capabilities with its aircraft having excellent range like a battlecruiser, but it's not necessarily going to be able to take hits from other aircraft. So you could argue that in a way the Battle of Midway was fought between battlecruisers, the Japanese and the Americans putting out very large air groups but not necessarily being able to take a large number of hits, as the Japanese unfortunately discovered. Now, if we fast forward to the British carriers, now, yes, Ark Royal, of course, is a Pacific carrier designed to put out a large air group at the expense of its armor. But then you look at any British carrier serving in the Mediterranean, they have very, very, very heavy armor plating with the armored hangar. This means that they can take 1,000-pound bomb hits from the Regia Marina and the Fliegerkorps German air groups. I'd argue that that would be effectively a battleship. It can give out hits, it can take them. However, we also see as we saw previously with the battleship and the cruiser, and therefore the battlecruiser, diverging and converging and diverging and converging over the decades, where you suddenly get the battleship and the battlecruiser merging to form the fast battleship and form the Queen Elizabeth, the Hood, etc., etc., etc. After the war, you get the Americans trying to create the Midway class carrier, which has good armor and can put out a large air group. So again, you sort of get the fast carrier, as it were, being formed in the same way that the fast battleship was formed. This brings us to the final point, and I'm not sure I should say this. I should be very careful. But I do wonder if we're reaching the point where if we get reasonably high-speed destroyers, like the Zumwalt successor, up to a certain tonnage, let's say 20, 30,000 tons possibly, don't know, high enough speed, it escorts the carriers, has very high armament of multiple vertical launch missile cells. Is that a destroyer? Or is that more like, say, a cruiser or a battleship? Keeping in mind, as I've said previously, the cruiser and the battleship do often converge in role and characteristics. Is it possible that the replacement destroyer for the US Navy could effectively be a battlecruiser?
I wouldn't be surprised. It's a very useful ship design. I don't know if you touched on the Kirovs.
I haven't got around to that one. No.
The Russians built these things essentially as carrier killers. So they need to be fast, lots of firepower, and the only way to get that on a long range was a big hull. They have minimal armor, roughly the same as their cruisers. Does actually beg the question if they're ever going to utilize the one that they've got left, given what happened to the Moskva. Pull the trigger, blow your own ship in half. It wouldn't be good. But I think the key point we're taking away from this is the combination of firepower and speed does not necessarily mean that something's a battlecruiser or a battleship. There's a crossover or merge point somewhere during the First World War where it becomes absolutely clear that people want both. Between the wars, all the treaty battleships are a compromise. The Royal Navy decreases gun size, essentially to get it on the tonnage, and also because of industrial problems, by the way, something which most people don't want to talk about in Britain. The Americans cut the armour back, given the tonnage of the ship, to get more speed. Is that not what we mentioned with the Invincibles?
Yep.
Speed means more machinery, or more powerful machinery that's generally heavier, means you can't have as much armour in the same displacement. None of the treaty battleships are particularly perfect. They all have flaws. The Italian ones have terrible anti-torpedo defences. The French ones, everything's up front. The right hit might actually take the ship out in terms of a combat unit without sinking it. The British ones have 14-inch guns, and the quadruple turrets are so complex it would actually have been better before twin turrets, because the output, which we mentioned right at the beginning, would have been much higher. The American ones, and this is something I will come back to because we're going to talk a little bit about operations in the South Pacific at some point, have problems in their armour plan. And those problems were not detected at the design stage and were only found following an engagement in the South Pacific. We'll come back to that. It's fascinating. So, are battle cruisers a waste of money? Geoff, do you think they are?
No.
Good answer. Neither do I. I actually think they're a key part of the design of modern ships. I think they're a key stage in the development of the warship as a whole. And I think they had a part to play in naval warfare in the 20th century. It should be noted that the Royal Navy retained renown right to the end of World War II in commission, whereas they actually decommissioned some of the R-class battleships. The reason for that was she'd be converted to a fast carrier escort. She had good range, she had a decent main armament, adequate armour, and a very good AA fit. That's starting to sound a bit like the Iowas.
Oh, absolutely. One thing I will say very quickly is that the KGVs had a sufficiently good AA fit and radar fit that Japanese planes that thought they were outside the reach of American units correctly didn't realize they weren't out of range of British units. And you have records of individual Japanese planes getting smoked by precision shots from 5-inch guns.
Fascinating. To be fair, the Royal Navy learned very rapidly in World War II all about how to defend its ships against airstrikes. That's another thing that I think we'll talk about in another video.
Vanguard weapon fit.
Yeah, we need to do some digging into this to understand the importance of it. And the other thing at some point I'm going to talk about is the U-boat war. World War One and then World War II. And the man here, Mr. U-boat program himself, is going to be the man to talk about World War One, whereas I'm going to bore you shitless about it in World War II. And then we're going to see, back to that war crimes thing, what is a war crime? What's a crime against humanity? And are any of those things something that we really need to worry about right now in relation to Ukraine? Should Donitz have been thrown in jail? Should Nimitz have been thrown in jail? Should Cunningham have been thrown in jail?
Oh, absolutely. You know,
of course. I mean, Cunningham was a very evil commander to work for, from what I understand. You know, was he wrong to want to cashier Mountbatten? Probably not. But we'll come to all of these really exciting naval topics at some point. I think the thing to do now is wind up for this evening. Thank you very much for watching. Thanks for putting up with me disappearing. The thud you heard was my mother dropping something. God knows what she was playing at. I did say, please don't interrupt this, but you know what? The real world's out there. It does impinge, and it's better we leave some of this in. I hope you've enjoyed it. Like it, share it. If you don't like it, click the don't like button. But I'm pretty sure you'll have enjoyed it. So please like us, please share us, please follow us. And over time, you're going to learn a lot more about some of the things we do in-house, because we'll walk you through some of the game development parameters that we're working with. Jeffrey will educate you a hell of a lot more about naval stuff. I learn stuff from him every time we talk. And we're also going to get economic at some point. That'll be fun. Night all. Have a good one, guys. Take care.